Good afternoon. I'm Vince Velazquez, and welcome to Law&Crime Network's Keeping the Peace, where from a law enforcement perspective, we're tackling today's important issues relating to social justice and law enforcement reform. With the most recent death of George Floyd, much scrutiny has been placed on law enforcement. Seemingly, critics of antiquated policing models are calling for reform and real changes within the system. As we examine cases from around the country, new video has surfaced that captures an encounter between a New Jersey State Trooper and 28-year-old Maurice Gordon, who can be seen on dash cam video fighting with the trooper on the side of the highway. Gordon was shot and killed by the trooper, and it was determined that he was unarmed. Let's take a look at the video.
Yeah. You want a mask like this to wear? Yeah? Yeah. You want a mask? Did you have one in your car or not? I'll go put them in the bugs out of here. Get the fucking car. Get the fucking car. Get the car now. Get the car. One time, give me another unit now. Get out of the car. Get the fuck out of the car. Get out of the car now. Get the fuck out. Get out of the car. Get out of the fucking car now. Get the fuck out. Get the fuck out. Get the fuck out. One cop, get me another unit. One cop, get me another unit. Get the fuck out. Get the fuck out. One cop shot fired. One cop shot fired. One cop shot fired.
Hard video to watch. It appears that Gordon may have been suffering from some sort of mental episode, but according to the trooper, Gordon fought with him, attempted to steal his cruiser, and then also attempted to grab the trooper's weapon. So let's get into it. But before we do that, let me welcome my guest to the show, Kirk Burkhalter, retired NYPD detective. Like, this guy's done everything. Lawyer and now law professor. Welcome to the show, Kirk.
My pleasure, Vince.
You know, so let's unpack this here. I mean, you were over 20-year detective. I'm sure you've seen officer-involved shootings. As difficult as this is to watch, looking at it from a law, I want to tap into your law enforcement expertise first, and then we'll switch over to your legal perspective. But from a detective's point of view, the factors that we know of right now, and we don't know everything, you know, on the surface, what considerations should law enforcement be looking at as far as the investigation goes?
So the first thing that jumped out at me was the deceased in custody? And if he was, why wasn't he handcuffed? So at the end of the day, police can't really detain someone. There are narrow instances. We all know about stop and frisk, and I don't want to open that can of worms, but certainly someone can detain someone if there's reasonable cause to believe that they had committed or are committing or will commit a crime. That's one form of detention. And then the other type is arrest. So if he is in the car, why isn't he handcuffed in the car? He had a seatbelt on and so forth. He offers him a mask. So it seems that, don't know, but from the video, he wasn't under arrest at that point. The minute he exits the car, troopers trying to get him back in the car. So was he in custody? Was he not? Or was he under arrest? The second point is the big ticket item here is the use of deadly physical force. Clearly, physical altercation but did that altercation warrant the use of deadly physical force? So not every physical altercation warrants the use of deadly physical force. Just because a police officer engages in the fisticuffs with a defendant, a suspect, hey, not everyone wants to be placed under arrest. But that doesn't mean if you don't want to come with me, I have the right to shoot you. There are absolutely certain standards for the use of deadly physical force. Doesn't appear that the decedent here was armed. So that's another huge question to ask. So there are many questions from this video that we see that we just don't have the answer to. Why was he detained? There seems to be a question as to whether he was speeding and then whether he needed a tow truck. He was waiting there for a tow truck. Why was he forcing him to stand in the car? That's a form of detention. Was it a lawful arrest? And then why the use of deadly physical force here?
Great points. And, I want to just touch on from the investigative standpoint. In my career, I was tasked with investigating cases like this. And what's so critical, it's been my experience that police departments are really falling on is that you have one opportunity when you arrive on scene as an investigator to get that information. And one thing is if an officer is claiming someone tries to take their weapon, before you do anything, and I've done this, you need to photograph that officer and swab the weapon, swab his holster. You have one chance to determine whether or not you may find DNA. The absence of DNA doesn't mean it didn't happen, but if it is there, then that can help support that claim. But that is often looked over. That's a tool that law enforcement has at their disposal. I'll be following this case, and it's going to be interesting to see how this thing develops. But switching gears, this video is important. And video is such an important tool in cases like this, trying to determine whether or not the officer acted appropriately. Such was the case with Eric Garner in New York City in 2014 after an encounter with NYPD officers after allegedly selling cigarettes on the street. The man who filmed that encounter, Eric Garner's friend, has had his fair share of trouble ever since. Let's take a look at the video.
As of today, I'm dealing with some legal situations that I'm still fighting. The police in New York are tough, they're cold-hearted. Some of them are okay, but the most, out of my experience dealing with NYPD, has been a bad time. Filming the Eric Garner death has changed my life in a major way, both positive and negative, but mainly negative because I'm dealing with legal situations and harassment.
Orta, who's a friend of Eric Garner, was actually charged with weapons possession just a month after filming his friend's death. He spent 4 years in prison, and after his release, he's claimed that the NYPD has been targeting him only because he filmed Eric Garner's death. That's a huge claim, Kirk. You were NYPD. You're very familiar with how that department works. What are your thoughts on his claim that NYPD targeted him because he filmed Eric Garner's death?
So I don't know the gentleman, but let's just presuppose that in order to engage in that type of targeting, it would take several police officers to conspire to do so. Could that happen? Well, we've seen all types of things in the news recently that we never thought would happen. However, I would also think it would take several police officers who are incredibly not cognizant or not self-aware of the amount of attention that this case would draw. So, this is juxtaposed with the fact that the gentleman here does have a criminal record. I don't know if he was engaged in any other activity or allegedly engaged in any activity after he was released. However, I would think the police department would know that they're living under an age of very heightened scrutiny here. So, as I mentioned, sometimes the crazier the story, the more likely it is to be true. I would certainly like to see some other evidence. So in other words, even if he was arrested of a particular crime or charged with a particular crime or accused of a crime, have others in the same geographical vicinity been accused of that particular crime. So I would like to see the evidence of this harassment in order to opine further. It's very unfortunate, and I am sure that this was a life-changing moment for this gentleman. He's ever going to be remembered for this. And certainly, this occurred in Staten Island. It's a small area here in New York. It's a tight-knit community, and I'm certain that everyone knows who he is. It would not be unreasonable to think that the police there are not pleased with him, but it takes a great leap to change that displeasure to action. So I would like to see a little bit more evidence of this particular action in order to move forward and really start to believe that this is occurring.
Yeah, those are great points. What I've found also is that many times police officers actually, they believe that their actions were justified most of the time, but they believe what happened was correct and they were following procedures. And oftentimes we find out later that it wasn't. It was either improper or illegal. So with that said, if an officer's acting under the idea that they are correct in their actions, then video should help them. It should show what they did was proper. I know there's two sides to that coin. This particular gentleman, he was friends with Eric Garner, so it's an emotional ride for him. He's also made claims that, even the gun charge he had was not really a charge that he should have gotten. So those are big claims that he has made against the NYPD. And again, we have to see how this thing plays out. When we come back from break, we're going to talk about a controversial law in New York that was repealed last night that shielded police officers from having their disciplinary records made public. Big move on their part. We'll get into that when we come back from the break. Welcome back. Last night, New York State voted to repeal a law named 50A, making police disciplinary records public. Governor Andrew Cuomo has said he would sign the bill. The NYPD's Patrolmen's Benevolent Association is adamantly against the repeal. Is this bill a step in the right direction? Some say yes, some say no. Advocates intensified the call for repeal following the death of Eric Garner in 2014, as the officer involved in that case had various disciplinary infractions. And if you remember, this case out of Minneapolis, George Floyd, that officer, Chauvin, had upwards of 18 prior complaints. Let's see what the governor had to say.
It is enough. It is enough, because it's been the same point over and over and over again. Bring reforms to the criminal justice system. Bring reforms to policing. We've seen the same situation happen 20, 30, 40 times. How many times do you have to see the same situation before you act? And we're going to act in the state of New York. Transparency of disciplinary records for police officers, what they call a repeal of 50A, which, by the way, what 50A says is the records of police officers will no longer be exempt from disclosure. So the records of police officers will be like every other public employee, right? They'll be like teachers, they'll be like CSEA employees or DC 37 employees in New York City. Their records will be available. And if people made complaints about them, they will be in the record and they will be released.
So here we go. We have a law that exists in New York City, or did exist in New York City. In some states, it doesn't. When we talk about this law, I can tell you right now, 23 states have a law similar to that on the books. 15 states have limited availability, and 12 states, including my state here in Georgia, that is no requirement, meaning your record is open. Kirk, you are not only a retired detective, which, you could have experienced that on one end, but you're also an attorney and a law professor. You have you should have a robust opinion on this. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I certainly do. And as a matter of fact, I was in the police department. I spent a lot of time working in an undercover capacity where your identity records are sealed. So I certainly sympathize with police officers who are somewhat perturbed by this. However, I think there's some misinformation, and here's why. When I worked in an undercover capacity, you certainly couldn't go down to City Hall or Police Plaza and look up my address and my license plate number of my personal car and so forth. That's one issue. And I think that's some of the fear that we hear from various police unions. But that's not what this is about. This is about narrowly focused on the disciplinary records of police officers. And that's a completely different story. So that information is not going to give away where a police officer resides, where their children go to school, and people can stalk them and so forth. Now, what's an important reality of police work is the more active a police officer is, the more likely they are to have complaints. Now, there is a threshold. So that doesn't mean if you're out here and you're very active, you're making a lot of arrests, that you have a million complaints. Absolutely not. There is a threshold. Whenever we look at Minneapolis, this police officer having 18 complaints, that's excessive. And especially if where there's smoke, there's fire, if those complaints tend to be about the excessive use of force, once again, that is a smoking gun. However, for instance, take myself as an example. Made over 600 arrests or so throughout my career and was involved in hundreds and hundreds more. Guarantee you I had a few complaints, without a doubt. People are not happy. Some people are not happy about being arrested, and they're going to reach out the best way they can. And certainly when someone is incarcerated, sometimes they're going to reach out and touch you. However, there is a threshold. And once you start getting up into, well, let's look at it two ways. Once the same complaint is made over and over, and once you start getting up into the teens and so forth, that could be a problem. Of course, the other thing that police officers are worried about is someone trying to claim that you acted in conformity with your past behavior. So just because I was accused of doing X amount of times doesn't mean I did it this time. So these are all what's at issue here. However, at the end of the day, this train left the station a long time ago. It is time for the police to work with the public, find common ground so faith can be restored in the police department, because right now there's a little lack of faith and mistrust. And police need to gain that back by working with the public. I don't think taking the us against them route is really going to be helpful for other side.
Indeed, indeed. That was one of the best robust explanations I've ever seen. So I don't even need to say anything about it. Thank you so much. NYPD is not so happy about that. And because of that, the NYPD union bosses have had a press conference. They've made it known, and they had a lot to say. Let's take a look at the video.
This isn't stained by someone in Minneapolis. It's still got a shine on it. And so do theirs. So do theirs. Stop treating us like animals and thugs, and start treating us with some respect. That's what we're here today to say. We've been left out of the conversation. We've been vilified. It's disgusting. It's disgusting. Trying to make us embarrassed of our profession. 375 million interactions. Overwhelmingly positive. Nobody talks about all the police officers that were killed in the last week in the United States of America, and there were a number of them. We don't condone Minneapolis. We roundly reject what he did as disgusting. It's disgusting. It's not what we do. It's not what police officers do. Our legislators abandoned us. The press is vilifying us. Well, you know what, guys? I'm proud to be a cop. And I'm going to continue to be proud to be a cop until the day I retire. And that's all I have to say.
Wow. Okay. He's obviously upset. I get it. I understand that. But a couple observations from my perspective. So I understand how police officers feel, especially in what's been happening lately with all of the protests and people literally putting the blame on the majority of police officers for the actions of a few bad apples. We're cops. I'm a retired law enforcement officer. I have to take that burden. Okay. However, one thing I would have loved to hear the union boss say is, let's talk about some of the things we've seen within NYPD during the protests, some of the abuses where people are being shoved to the ground. It would have resonated better with me had he recognized that they have room to make improvement, especially from what we've seen on TV. And I'm not talking about one incident. I'm talking about several that we've seen on TV. The second thing that's a huge observation for me is when you look at the officers standing behind the union boss, there's not a lot of diversity there. We're talking 30,000 plus member police department. And when you go on national TV and make that outcry, you're not even representing the demographics of your own department. So that's something that, you know, I'm having trouble understanding. Kirk, that's your backyard. You were NYPD. I don't know if you're a member of the union or not. Chime in.
I certainly was. And as a matter of fact, it's mandatory to be a member of the union. And for a brief period of time, when I was assigned to the Organized Crime Control Bureau, I was a delegate for the Detectives Endowments Association for my command. So I get that. I get everything you're saying. Optics mean a lot, and we discuss this all the time. And when we, once again, this us against them, we want to stay away from that. We want to work together. I want to make one other point. You know, I loved being a cop, and I love the police. My father's a retired NYPD sergeant, and so is my brother. And so I come from a police family. And there's one thing I always learned. It's not personal. I've been cursed at and spit on and bottles thrown at me and shot at and all these other things, you know, you can think of. But whenever you're at these demonstrations and so forth, those things that occurred were never an attack on Kirk Burkhalter. When you wear the uniform, you are an extension of the government. And what the public is doing and what they're saying, they are voicing their displeasure with the government, be it local, federal, or state, and how the government is policing their community. So what I would like to see is sometimes to take the personal feelings about it out of it. Are people attacking
Kirk,
that particular union person? No, they're attacking
Kirk, those are very, sorry to interrupt you, those are very good points,
Sure.
but we're coming to the last part of our show. And I just wanted to touch on what you said. Your optics are very important, and you make some really good observations. And what I really appreciate about your perspective is you come from the police side of things and the law enforcement side of things. We have to make some changes, and I hope that the union can understand there's two sides of this, and they should recognize that. We want our police officers to remain safe, but we also want justice and we want fairness. So for our show, Keeping the Peace, we want to talk about both sides of the coin. Tomorrow, we'll be back with more. Thank you.